Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sharon Stein. I'm the instructor for this course, EDST 536 Higher Education Systems in Canada. And I'm very excited to be starting off the course. I know this wasn't the format that we had originally intended, but I think that we can do a lot in this format and I'm excited about the course. So I'm going to start out today with reviewing the syllabus for the course. My request is that you take some time to read it on your own very carefully to see if you have any questions about the expectations or the deadlines or any other part of it. And if you have questions after reading it and after this lecture, please either feel free to email me to post them on the frequently asked questions section of Canvas, or to bring them to our first synchronous meeting on May 13th. After we review the syllabus, we will talk about some guiding frameworks for the course and also think about higher education as a field of study, and then think about higher education systems in general and in Canada in particular. Before we start the course in earnest, however, I want to start by acknowledging that UBC and myself are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I know that it's a bit different doing this acknowledgement when we are meeting virtually as opposed to when we are there in person. But nonetheless, the virtual space also happens in very material locales. So I think it's maybe a question for us to consider in this course. What does it mean in terms of our institutional and individual obligations to the Indigenous nations whose lands our institutions occupy, both when we're there in person and when we're meeting virtually? So that's maybe a question we can take with us throughout this course. Before we start the lecture, I actually want to take a moment and just talk a bit about the current context that we find ourselves in, because I don't think it serves us or this course to pretend like this is any old moment in time. So we are in an unprecedented moment. We are facing a lot of uncertainty and complexity in terms of our own individual lives, in terms of our institutions, and in terms of higher education in general. So all of this is going to affect our course in ways that may or may not be predictable, and in ways that maybe have good dimensions and then maybe have limiting dimensions. So I don't want us to erase that part from our conversations and our considerations, and I want to just offer some invitations to you at the start of the course. So one of these is a question for all of us to think about, which is, how can we learn to sit with and be taught by the complexities and uncertainties of the moment, rather than immediately try to resolve them? How can we develop the stamina to face the ongoing challenges that have emerged and by all accounts will continue to emerge? And that's not just the challenges of a public health pandemic, but also the challenges of climate change crises, of political instability, of economic unpredictability. So these all are sort of different dimensions of crisis that are related to one another, and all of which are going to affect higher education in both the near and distant future. So one thing we can do is to think about this current context as a means to actually think through and deepen the way that we are studying higher education in this course and throughout your degree. So how does this context challenge maybe the questions, frameworks, and theories that we already use in higher education studies? Are these frameworks adequate for the existing moment? And if they aren't, then what other kinds of frameworks do we need? What other kinds of questions do we need to be asking? So you are very welcome to bring those kinds of considerations into the course, to relate them to the readings and the themes each week. And that's kind of the intellectual dimension of it. The other dimension of it is the fact that because this is an unprecedented moment, we don't know, things might change in unpredicted ways like they did last term. So I'm requesting that we all have a kind of sense of flexibility with the course. If things need to shift, then we will shift accordingly. And those might be shifts that affect all of us in the course, or it may be something that affects you as individuals. So if it's on an individual level, please just feel free to communicate with me. If you are sick or you find someone in your immediate circles are sick, if there's any other things that are affecting your ability to complete the course, please communicate with me and we will adjust accordingly. Okay, so that's it for the caveats. Let's get to the course itself. So we'll start with a syllabus, and I know it's quite lengthy, so I won't review it in detail. As I said, my request is that you take some time to go through it and see if there are any questions that emerge. But the general format of the course is that each week you'll be expected to watch a recorded lecture. And generally, as is the case with this lecture, the lectures will be posted onto YouTube because the files are too big for Canvas and linked to on Canvas. And I'll also upload the PowerPoints so that you can follow along if you want to stop and look at something more carefully. And those will be posted by the Monday of each week. You're also required to do the assigned readings. And as always, there are some suggested readings if you want to go deeper. You're being asked to complete a weekly reading quiz, which is just a means of keeping us all accountable and highlighting some of the key points from the readings. Then there will be an online discussion each week, and this is the only synchronous dimension of the course, i.e., this is the only time where you need to be doing something at the same time as other people in the course. So every Wednesday, we will meet. And I've made the times for meeting the same times as the in-person meetings of the course. And we are dividing ourselves up into two sections. Because there's over 20 students in the course, I want to make sure the quality of the conversations are high. So I've divided you up into two groups. So the first group will meet at 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. on Wednesday. The second group will meet from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Except for the first week, when we will have a meeting from 4:30 to 6 for the first group, and then 6 to 7:30 for the second group. And that's just because since it's the beginning of the course, there are probably more questions, and we want to be able to do an introduction of the people in the group. So you will be getting an email with a link to sign up for one of the two groups. So I ask that you do that, and then you'll know which time you're supposed to meet. And there is a sort of set style of those online discussions because I know that our attention spans are limited after a certain point. That's why the meetings are fairly short, but that also means that we need to stay on track. So if you'll see in the syllabus that there's a series of 4 rounds that make up the discussion sections. I won't go into detail now. You can read them on the syllabus. And each person in each round will get a chance to speak, or you can pass. And that will take up essentially the whole hour of our meeting each week. And then finally, each week, well, not every week, but 3 of the weeks of the course, you will be asked to complete a mini paper that just allows me to see more of your thinking in depth than I'm able to see in our online discussions. And the prompts for each of these papers are in the syllabus and online as well. And then finally, the biggest part of your grade will be the final project. And if you've had a course with me before, it's a similar style. I like to leave this open-ended for students and have them create something that's actually useful for them, either in furthering their studies or in their practice. So there's 2 options. There's always the option to write a traditional scholarly essay, and if you are a PhD student or maybe an MA student and you want to use this opportunity to develop some ideas further, you're very welcome to do that. The other option is what I call a critical creative project, and this is fairly open. So there are many different formats you could use. You could make a podcast, a YouTube video, a comic book, a zine, a children's book. I've had people make games before, some really excellent games. You could do a series of TikTok videos. So it's really up to you and your imagination in terms of the style. In terms of the topic, essentially anything, this is for both the essay and the creative project, anything you can think of that would deepen your understanding and analysis of Canadian higher education, and that would then translate that for the Critical Creative Project to a wider audience. So we can think of this as, if you're not doing the traditional scholarly essay, a knowledge mobilization effort. And that's just a fancy way of saying taking what you've learned, taking a theory or a concept, and bringing it to a wider audience in a way that's more accessible to them. So you'll be asked to think about what you want to do, and then midway through the term to submit your idea so that I can give some feedback, and then you will finish that at the end of the term. So as I said before, please bring your questions to our first discussion on May 13th, or feel free to email me, of course, if you can't find the answer already in the syllabus or on Canvas. Now I will move on to some guiding frameworks for the course. Again, if you've taken a course with me, some of this will be familiar, but I wanted to reiterate for this course as well. So my stance as an instructor, my pedagogical approach, is never to tell students what to do or think. First of all, you are adults and you have your own context, your own personal context and professional context, and you need to approach the course in ways that are useful for you. So it's never to tell you how to do your job or how to approach higher education. It's rather to invite you to, what I say is dig deeper and relate wider. So I will say a bit about what that means. The idea is not to have you agree with what you're reading or even disagree with it either. That's really not the point. You may have that reaction and that's fine. But what I'm really interested in is what you are learning from the process of engaging these ideas in the readings, in the lectures, and in our discussions. So for instance, if you read an article and you have a really negative reaction to it, that's an interesting observation. So rather than share with us in the discussion that you didn't like the article and that you had a bad feeling about it, my invitation to you is to ask, where is that bad feeling coming from? What are you learning from that response? Where, in terms of your own individual history, or perhaps in our larger social historical context, is that response coming from? Or perhaps you had multiple responses and some of them were even conflicting. How are you making sense of that, those contradictions within ourselves and maybe within our institutions? So what you want to share with me and with the group is generally not your immediate response per se, but what you're learning after reflecting more on that response. And I'll say more about that in the next slide. But for now, again, the goal is to dig deeper into these issues and topics that we're encountering. So connecting the dots in your analysis, things that you maybe noticed but didn't put together before in the same way, and the readings are helping you do that. And also relating wider. So thinking about how can we respond to the problems that we face in our institutions and in higher education in general in ways that are accountable to the different social communities that we're part of, as well as the larger ecological context as well. So if you're confused, hopefully this slide will help a bit. So this is about the different layers of engagement. So the basic layer that I hope we all do is to think about this, what I call the self-reflective piece, which is, okay, what is the text arguing? That's the basics. We have to start there before we go deeper. What is the author arguing? And how am I responding to this text? What am I thinking about it? What am I feeling about it? This is really important. And again, we can't do the other layers if we don't start with this one. But I'm inviting you to go a bit deeper and say, okay, well, I see what the text is arguing. Let me now understand how it's making that argument. What theories is it drawing on? What assumptions is it using? What conversations is it intervening in? And what are the history of those conversations? Because when we read academic articles, we have to understand that they're not standalone conversations or interventions. They're part of a longer, larger history of arguments and hopefully adding something new or maybe challenging a long-held idea. So ask how the text is making that argument, where it's coming from, and then when you think about the layer of your own response, ask, why am I thinking or feeling this way? What, again, in my own history and or maybe in the history of the society I'm a part of, is inviting those feelings or those thoughts. And then I invite you to go even further to what I call the meta self-reflexive layer, which is, in a way you could say, you're watching yourself watching. So the first layer is you're paying attention to how you're responding. The second layer is you're taking a step back from that and asking where that response is coming from. And then the meta self-reflexive layer is thinking in a larger picture about the sense you're making of those observations. So something that might come up at this layer is, what further questions does the text prompt me or us to ask? And maybe, what am I learning about how I think or feel about the text? How might the text shift or inform my own context? So this is like taking it to the next level. You're not just understanding the argument or how it's being made, but understanding its implications. So one way of summarizing this layer is, so what? So you get to the end of a text, you understand its argument, where it's coming from, and then you ask, okay, so what? What difference does it make to have this argument on the table as opposed to when we didn't have it before we read it? So I'm most interested in this third layer because I think it gets at the most depth and complexity, but I hope we're engaging in all the layers as well. Another guiding framework for the course is what I call different approaches to reform. And the origins of this map or this cartography is the fact that most scholarship in higher education, and in fact in general, is focused on problems and trying to identify and then address them. So sometimes the lines get blurred and we say, okay, we all agree that there's a problem here. And then when people have different ways of approaching that problem, that's when things get messy and confusing. So if we can all agree that yes, probably most people have something that they would like to see changed or reformed in higher education, but there are different ways of approaching change or reform, that's where the starting point for this is. So the first approach to reform is what I call minor reform. And this essentially, if we think big picture, it's the world is pretty good as is, but we're going to make it a little bit better. So the vision for higher education would be transforming institutional policies and practices to ensure effectiveness, efficiency, and inclusiveness. And we would want to pluralize the available perspectives. This is a pretty typical approach for many institutions and for many scholars of higher education as well. You wouldn't get a lot of argument from a lot of people starting with this point. The next kind of reform goes a bit further in its critique and says, okay, the world is actually kind of screwed up and we need to make it not just a little better, but a lot better. And what we're going to do in order to do that is to not just include marginalized voices in our institutions, but actually center those voices and enable them and empower them to become leaders of the institutions, and not just in terms of representation, but also in terms of resource distribution. So how can we make the institutions equitable in a deeper way rather than just inviting people into the same institution? And then the beyond reform approach. So the major reform has some uptake in the field of higher education studies and in our institutions. It's not probably as common as the minor reform approach, but the beyond reform is fairly rare. It is present, and I think with current global crises, it might get more and more attention. So I think it's something we should have on the table to further our thinking, even though it's not going to be mainstream. And in some cases, it might not be legible. So by that, I mean, if you raise this beyond reform approach, in some contexts, in some institutions, people won't even understand basically what you're proposing. Because it is quite different than either the minor or major reform. It says, actually, this world is messed up to a point where it might not be able to be saved, which doesn't mean the end of the world as such, but the end of a particular way of knowing and being. And what we need to do is disinvest from our investment in the continuity of that world, learn from its mistakes, and foster other worlds and enable other worlds to emerge. The vision for higher education is basically two parts. The first one is, as long as we have our institutions, we have to mitigate harm and create those opportunities for greater equity, bring in those other voices and support them. So while we do that, at the same time, we need to think maybe this approach to higher education needs to end, and we need to have a totally other kind of institution or university, one that maybe right now isn't even imaginable. But that's a long-term project. So you have the short-term mitigating harm and the long-term, like, more transformation. So I've tried to select readings in the course that touch on each of these, but as you'll note, in the higher education field, in the literature specifically, minor reform is the most common. Major reform is sometimes there. Beyond reform generally comes from other fields that are looking at higher education, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But I invite you, as you're doing the readings for the course, to think about, is this a minor reform approach? Is this a major reform approach? Is this a beyond reform approach? Or maybe is it combining some of these? And what is that approach to reform doing for the text, and how is it enabling things, and how is it maybe limiting things or precluding us from asking certain questions that might be important? And you can even think about it yourself in your own context. Where do you put yourself in terms of these reforms? And maybe it shifts depending on where you are. Maybe when you're in the classroom, for instance, you go more toward a major reform, but in your job in the office, you kind of have to toe the line at minor reform and then look for opportunities to gesture towards something beyond that. So these are not fixed positions, and you don't have to identify with one or disidentify with one, but there are different ways of approaching change in higher education. So to complexify that just a bit more, in addition to minor, major, and beyond reform, we also have positions of no reform, which is people who say, actually everything is fine as it is, we don't need to make any major changes, and the requirement is really that we stay the course, that we continue doing what we're doing. And then there's also what I call regressive reform. So those would be people who do want to change, but they want a change that goes back to some other imagined past. So if you think about, for instance, some of the backlash against moves towards diversity and equity, people who say that we are losing the Western canon, for instance, by bringing in racialized authors, this would be a regressive reform. People who say, no, we've gone in the wrong direction, we need to go back, we need to make a change, but it's a change to restore some vision that they had before. So generally, regressive reform you wouldn't find in the higher education literature, but you might find in newspaper articles or in op-eds, and I think you probably have some examples already in mind of that as well. So the invitation is, again, to, as you're doing your reading, as you're thinking through the concepts, think about which kind of approach to the reform are they using and what difference does that make. The other thing I'll say is that sometimes people will have one of these approaches to reform in terms of the analysis they offer, but then their proposed response is from a different space. So what I mean by that is that maybe you have a really deep critique of the institution and saying, like, basically this thing is a colonial construct, there's no way we can reform it, but you don't want to say, and therefore we need to tear it down, because you still want the institution, you still want to work with it. So you say, it is a colonial institution, but these are the major reforms we can make. So sometimes we can have an analysis or a diagnosis of the problem that differs from the proposed response. And sometimes people do that strategically, again, because maybe people in their institution can't understand the beyond reform approach, or maybe it's because we're not really there yet. But I do invite you to pay attention to not just which approach to reform the articles are using, but also whether their analysis matches with their proposition. And if it doesn't match, why is that, and what are the implications of that? So again, some questions you can ask about these different reforms is trying to figure out where you are maybe on this chart, where you would like to be, and then also maybe where your institution is or where your office is and where you would like it to be. What is currently possible in your context? Is it possible to shift spaces? What are the barriers to doing that? You can also think about what are the tensions and generative overlaps between the different spaces. What questions could deepen, complexify, or challenge the conversations in each? Where should the conversations go from here? Maybe there's another space, another kind of reform that we haven't mapped that this new context is going to prompt us to think about. And then maybe relatedly, what is not mapped and what might not yet be mappable or imaginable, but a viable possibility sometime in the future. So that was a review of the course itself and some of the frameworks that we'll be coming back to again and again. But now I'm going to talk about some more relevant things for the content from this week's readings. So you'll see that in the Jones reading from 2012, he's talking about higher education as a field of study and how it developed in Canada. And just as a heads up, my approach to these lectures, as it is in person as well, is not that I'm going to repeat the content from the readings, although that might happen a bit, but I trust that you have done the readings, so there's no need to repeat things. But what I try to do is pick up some key points and maybe expound upon them, bring in other perspectives that aren't in the readings but were related to them. So before we think about higher education as a field of study in Canada in particular, I think it's useful to think about it in a general way as well. So it's common for people who approach the field of higher education study to frame it as an interdisciplinary field. So the focus is on the thematic area or the object of study, which is higher education, as opposed to a discipline like sociology or anthropology or ethnic studies. So according to Teichler, like other interdisciplinary research fields with a thematic focus, higher education tends to be driven to a certain extent by the dynamics of public debates. Without its ties to changing issues that are considered relevant or problematic, it would not exist, and without any critical distance to the actors' debates, it would not have a genuine mandate. So I think we can make a connection between here and between the emphasis on different approaches to reform. Generally speaking, you see here that he says we focus on issues that are considered relevant or problematic, so things that require our attention, essentially. And this is what sort of unites us as a field. If you think about higher education in Canada specifically, there's a particular history to it. So as Jones notes, it actually came about after World War II, and especially from people who had been working on policy changes at provincial and federal levels or institutional levels to advise basically the growth of the higher education system in Canada. So the people who founded the field of higher education studies in Canada were very invested in the expansion and in the public good dimension of higher education. So we can think about how is it that their social roles have structured the field itself, and the social roles being their jobs as people who were organizing this system expansion, but also thinking about their positionalities as well. Given the time especially, we know that the majority of these people were men, the majority of these people were white, and they were probably the majority middle to upper class. So that also shapes their approach to higher education. Even if their focus was expanding access and democracy, their positionality probably shaped the kind of knowledge they produced and therefore shaped the field as we have it today. Of course, things are shifting, as Jones notes, and as you've probably observed as well, but we can still see how those roots of the field shape the field today. The other thing that I think is worth considering, just as people who are studying in Canada, potentially working in Canada, and maybe living in Canada for the rest of your lives or for the foreseeable future, is that there's a bunch of different professional organizations in Canada related to higher education that might be relevant for you. And Jones mentioned some of these, but they are the Canadian Society for the Study of Higher Education, the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, Canadian Association of College and University Student Services, Canadian Institutional Research and Planning Association, and there's more. So if you're someone who is thinking about working in this field, whether as a practitioner and or a scholar, then it might be worthwhile to check out some of these associations to see if maybe you want to be part of them or attend their annual meetings. And if not that, even just check out the resources that they've created for you. The other thing I want to say a bit more about is that while Jones and someone like Teichler in the previous quote are emphasizing higher education as an interdisciplinary field, there is other ways to study higher education as well. So in our program at UBC, it's generally approached from this interdisciplinary field focus. However, another common way of approaching higher education, as I mentioned before, is to come at it from a discipline. So people who are trained as sociologists, trained as anthropologists, or ethnic studies scholars, but look at higher education from their discipline. So they might not attend the higher education studies meetings, they might attend the Sociology Association meetings, but their focus is higher education. And I've tried in the course to bring in both of these perspectives and more. So I have another map here of different ways of studying higher education that might be useful for you. The first one, again, is the dominant one probably in this course and in our program, but I've also tried to bring in the other perspectives. So I won't go through these again in detail. The PowerPoint will be uploaded. But the emphasis for higher education studies is generally focused on higher education for the service of liberal democracy. So the focus is on expanding access, supporting student development, ensuring shared governance at the institutional level, ensuring that institutions are serving the public good, are in the service of meritocracy as well, and social mobility. And then critical university studies is only just emerging, and it has largely come from humanities scholars who are not trained in the higher education field, but who are trained, for instance, in English, and have become frustrated with the marketization and privatization of institutions, and have offered their own analysis informed by their own discipline and their own theoretical training. And there's a lot that resonates between critical university studies and higher education studies. I think the critical university studies goes a bit further in its critique in some areas. It's more focused, for instance, on labor relations than higher education studies. But essentially, both have this analysis of higher education as the state we're in is basically progress interrupted. So generally framing, especially the post-war era, as this moment of growth and expansion as possibility that was interrupted by the neoliberal economic shift. And if you don't know what that is, we're going to talk about it in the course, so don't worry. And they generally want some kind of restoration of more of a public good orientation for higher education. The abolitionist university studies, which is even newer than the critical university studies, is again people coming from other disciplines, especially people in labor studies, people in queer studies, in women's studies, in Black studies, Indigenous studies, and they have more of the beyond reform approach that I was mentioning earlier to higher education. They say even this notion of progress that the higher education studies and the critical university studies people are invested in was problematic because it came at a cost. It was always certain populations that suffered as a result of these initiatives to serve the public that was generally imagined as a white middle class public. So they have a question about whether the university can be reformed or not, as opposed to the critical university studies, which are more of the major reform approach, and again the higher education studies, which is more of that minor reform with some major reform people mixed in, because there's always a heterogeneity. And then finally I have the backlash or the reaction, which would correspond mostly to the regressive reform category that I talked about earlier. So I won't expand on that. But what I will say is that I also have a question mark there, again, for leaving space for other possibilities for the way we study higher education that maybe we haven't come up with yet. And maybe, again, the current context is going to prompt us to say, we have all of these gifts from these other approaches that offer us a lot, but maybe they aren't adequate for the moment. What other kinds of questions and approaches do we need to be taking? So, as you're thinking about these different approaches to studying higher education, again, I don't want to tell you which one is the most appropriate. You have to decide for yourselves. So, questions you might ask would be, what are the guiding assumptions, imaginaries, and investments that underlie these different ways of studying higher education? What difference do the different ways of studying higher education make? What new conversations need to be had? What new questions need to be asked? What kind of higher education futures do we imagine and desire? And do each of these approaches allow? How do the answers to these questions that we're asking here shape the way we're going to study and practice higher education? And how can we have these conversations and articulate these questions in rigorous, accountable, and impactful ways, and not just treat it like a belly button exercise where we're asking questions for the sake of asking? No, there are real world implications, and we are accountable to different communities in this work. So, higher education systems, the theme of the course, and especially the focus of this week's readings. So, what is a higher education system? People have different interpretations, of course. For Skolnick, a nation's post-secondary education system can be viewed as consisting of the various policy and planning structures, institutions, programs, and related activities of each of its constituent political jurisdictions and the formal and informal relationships among those educational jurisdictions. Teichler is a bit more succinct, although of course he has more to say on the matter. And essentially he says a higher education system refers to a national level system. So some of the elements of a system would be its geography. What countries does it cover, or what provinces does it cover? What are the political authorities in play in that place? So who is collecting the taxes? Who is distributing resources? The oversight, who has the power to govern how these systems are managed? What are the institutions involved? Not just the individual institutions, but the institutional types. So universities, colleges, university colleges, etc. What are the articulations between the different institutional types? So for instance, how is it possible, or is it possible, to transfer from a college to a university? What is the underlying strategy or strategic plan for the system? And how does the funding actually work? So most systems will have these things, and when you start asking these questions, what constitutes the system will start to be fleshed out. These are just some images of different systems to try and help us understand. So we have Ireland, the country here, its system, and we see that it's broken up in this image of universities, and then colleges, which is NUI, so National Universities of Ireland colleges, and then the Institutes of Technologies, and then private institutions. So for the person making this map, they've divided it up by institutional type and mapped where they fall across the nation. In the other picture, we have the U.S. state of Alabama, I believe. So again, we can see that they've divided it up by institutional types as well. So the four-year public institutions, the public universities, the community colleges, the technical colleges, and the not-for-profit independent institutions. So there's something similar about the U.S. system to the Canadian one, and that is that it's a federal system. So in Canada in particular, there is no federal education ministry at all, let alone a higher education ministry. So in a way, despite what Teichler says, which is that a higher education system is a national system, many people say that Canada actually has 13 different higher education systems. So 10 provinces, 3 territories. Then we can also say that there is a national level system in effect, even though it doesn't have an overarching view. So every province does things, or territory does things, a bit differently. And the way that the federal government interacts with higher education is always indirect, because actually it's in the Constitution that that the provinces and the territories have the authority over education. And they sometimes, historically, have pushed back when the federal government got too involved. So generally speaking, the federal role is indirect, and generally through funding. So for instance, through the federal research granting agencies. By funding particular work or not funding particular work, federal government can influence the direction of research at universities without having to come in and directly say, this is what we want you to work on. They also have a role in the student population by changing different immigration policies at the national level. So if they're trying to encourage international students and encourage immigration, their policies will enable that, or conversely disallow it in places that are becoming more strict about their immigration. And then, as I mentioned before, any higher education system, including Canada's, has different institutional types within that system. So not just different individual institutions, but institutional types. And in Canada, generally we have research universities and community colleges. But increasingly, we also have other kinds of institutions. We have university colleges, which are kind of a hybrid of colleges and universities that are relatively new. We have teaching universities that focus primarily on students as opposed to research, but they're four-year institutions. And then we also have institutes like technical institutes. The other thing to mention is that most institutions of higher ed in Canada are public, and as Jones notes, this is not public as in state-owned. They're effectively private institutions, but they're not for profit, and they receive considerable government funding, and they are thought to serve the public in a broader sense. So there are some private institutions in Canada, but they're quite few, especially as compared to a place like the US. One thing I also wanted to draw our attention to, and that are themes for this course, is the question of how do internationalization as well as indigenization and decolonization challenge the dominant both national or federal and provincial ways of imagining Canadian higher education. So we tend to think of these as national level systems, as Teichler does, or as provincial systems, but the scales become blurred when we have a greater emphasis on internationalization in terms of both our students and the content of our universities. And same thing when we think about indigenization. If we're thinking about the Indigenous nations whose territories are where our institutions are located, that also challenges the jurisdictional question. So if we think about this question in terms of elements of a system about who has the political authority, well, some people would say that the provincial government has the political authority, but other people would say, but actually, the authority needs to be shared or even fully deferred to the Indigenous nation of that place. So the invitation is an open one to think about how both internationalization and indigenization challenge traditional ways of studying higher education systems in Canada and in general. So just a few more thoughts on how systems of higher education developed over time. And some of these insights are from the US context, but they are also applicable to Canada, or we can ask, how are they applicable? One thing that you might notice about what I'm about to review is that many of these texts are fairly dated. They're from the 70s and 80s. And part of this has to do with the fact that these are considered foundational texts in the field of higher education studies, so it's important that we have some reference for them. The other is the fact that in many ways the study of higher education systems has not shifted terribly much from that time. And so it could be worth asking, what kinds of questions do we need to be asking today that we weren't asking then about higher education systems? So before we do that, let's think about the history of where this analysis came from. So the first one is Martin Troe. So he is a US-based scholar and theorizing system massification. So that is essentially theorizing how higher education became expanded and massified, especially in the US, for instance, or in Canada in the post-war era. And he has some sort of ways of theorizing this. So one of these is that we moved from elite higher education, where only a few generally wealthy people could access it, to mass higher education, so really expanding it is through things in the US like the GI Bill and Canada's equivalent, so that many more people could access, and moving toward a direction of universal higher education, i.e. everyone can access it in the same way that everyone accesses K through 12 education. He says that as we move from elite to mass to universal, higher education goes from a privilege of a few to a right that everyone has to access if they wish, to almost an obligation. And this can be understood in different ways, but one of them might be that as more and more people access higher education, to compete for good jobs, you essentially have to have a higher education credential. So it becomes an obligation, even if it might not be what people prefer. So he also has an analysis of how and why the system expanded at this time, and one of these was workforce needs. So essentially that employers at the time had needs that they wanted their employees to be trained for, but they didn't want to provide the training themselves. So the public actually picked up the cost of this training for potential employers. And especially in the post-war era, there were a lot of people returning from fighting in the war who wouldn't necessarily have jobs at the time because the economy was just starting to get picked back up. So higher education was also understood as a place to put people while they were training for jobs and to keep them out of trouble, essentially. This was sort of a stated rationale, although not necessarily always highlighted now, of the GI Bill. And then there's also this widened public demand in access to higher education because it is perceived to contribute to a rise in the standard of living. So it wasn't only that employers wanted it, but individuals wanted it too. And public funding obliged and expanded the system at this time. So Clark Kerr, who you may or may not have heard of, but was a professor at Berkeley, he helped create the Master Plan for California, which is, if you haven't heard of it, a sort of foundational policy document in the state of California that inspired some Canadian provincial systems as well. But essentially, in very brief terms, created a 3-tier system of higher education. So the open access essentially layer was community colleges, and then the next layer was the colleges, so the California State University system, so California State University Long Beach, California State University Monterey, etc. So that was higher standard admissions than the community colleges. And then at the top of the sort of pyramid of higher education in the master plan was the University of California system. So University of California, Los Angeles, University of California, Berkeley, etc. And the idea was that through this tiered system, anyone could access higher education. And if they were committed, they could then start at the community college level and then end up at the university level through transferring. And Kerr eventually not only helped create the plan for the master plan, but actually became the chancellor of the University of California. And I think his thoughts on the matter help illuminate some of the complexities and the contradictions of expanded access to higher education and the way that this affects the shape of the higher education systems we have. So he said at one point that mass and universal access to higher education may be the enemy of elite higher education. Well, what does he mean by that? He says, when I was guiding the development of the master plan for higher education in California, I considered the vast expansion of community colleges to be the first line of defense for the University of California as an institution of international academic renown. Otherwise, the university was either going to be overwhelmed by large numbers of students with lower academic attainments, or attacked as trying to hold on to a monopoly over entry into higher status. So essentially, my reading of this quote, and you might have a different one, is that rather than being motivated by a benevolent commitment to access and democratization and the public good, the master plan that it did allow for this democratization to a point was in part, at least, motivated by a desire to protect the elitism of the University of California system. So essentially he's saying that because we created this space where people could go who weren't as academically prepared, which of course has racial and economic implications, we could then protect the UCs as a place where the elite education could really happen. And he paints it as almost an attack. He said, well, he does say, being overwhelmed by large numbers of students. So it's almost like, to keep the hordes away, we will create this tiered system that will keep the riffraff out of the University of California system. So I think this kind of causes us to pause a bit, especially when we're romanticizing post-war higher education and its commitment to the public good, to kind of stop and ask, well, was that really the intention, or were there other things at play that may have shaped the systems we ended up with, and that may cause us to pause when trying to reproduce that vision again today? So Skolnick helps us understand the kind of dynamic that Kerr was essentially describing. So he's talking about system diversity, and when he says diversity, he means the diversity of institutional types and institutions rather than human diversity like racial diversity or gender diversity. So he says the benefits of diversity may be grouped into 3 categories: facilitating a better match of students with institutional characteristics, providing more specialized uses of resources, and allowing the coexistence of alternative models. So he says a diverse higher education system can accommodate both elite and mass higher education, which is the kind of thing that Clark Kerr was talking about, versus a uniform system that must choose between the two. So a higher education system must balance these 2 forces. Without mass education, a system might not be socially or politically viable. In other words, the public might not support a higher education system that's super elitist because they're not going to want to put funding towards something that most people can't access. However, without elite education, the system will not facilitate the development of the highest levels of excellence. So essentially agreeing with Clark Kerr a bit here, that we need to have both places where people can access and places where we protect the elitist education system. Then he also notes that diversity may enhance opportunities, but the more diverse a system, the more difference it makes which institution an individual attends. So in other words, as the types of institution that we had grew, we also saw a great differentiation between the institutional types. So a kind of system stratification. So there were different institutional types, and largely, or generally speaking, they were hierarchical. So people generally had more respect and reverence for the University of California than they did for the community college systems, or they had more respect for University of British Columbia than they did for a community college. Now, theoretically, this doesn't have to be the case. We don't have to have difference in hierarchy. We could have difference in inequality where it was flat, and we said there's no difference in value between highly selective and non-selective, but I am wondering if there are actual examples where this is the case, and I invite you, if you know of examples such as this, to bring them to our attention, because it's theoretically possible, but generally in practice we see the difference in hierarchy. So we see the stratified, in other words, that the highly selective is generally understood as the most elite, the most valuable higher education, versus the non-selective being less respected. And I think we can then think about the fact that this stratification, these hierarchies, are usually linked to income stratification. So it's generally the case, proportionally the case, that the higher the income of your family, the more you're able to access a highly selective institution, and the lower the income, the more you're able, generally funneled into the non-selective institution. There are always exceptions, but if we look at the statistics, this is generally the case. So how then might this hierarchy of not just differentiation, but stratification be impacting chances for equity in higher education systems? So, concluding guiding questions for us to take with from this unit, as well as we go throughout the course. Are our higher education systems in Canada, in terms of the different provincial systems, or in general at the national level, and then maybe you also want to think about a different system as in comparison, are these systems responsive to shifting social, political, economic, and ecological contexts? Are we actually responding to the changing world we find ourselves in, or are we clinging to old models? And if so, why? And what are the different accountabilities that should be considered when we're asking who we're being responsive to? What are the communities that that we are feeling accountable to, and who is prioritized in that? In whose name are we setting the agenda for the higher education system? Who is benefiting from this agenda? What does each higher education system type assume the purpose of higher education is? And how, again, I asked this question with the last set, how do or should the answers to these questions shape the way we study and practice higher education? So, in other words, if the higher education systems that we have now are largely shaped by the post-war era, which not only was coming from a particular moment in history, but also has these dimensions of expanding access at the same time as it expanded stratification, is this the kind of system we want to have today? And if it's not, how might we go about of changing it? So then we can bring back the reforms. Which layer of minor reform, major reform, beyond reform do we want to bring in here? So I leave you with these questions. I look forward to hearing your thoughts when we meet on May 13th, as well as your questions. Thank you so much.